I pulled up to the Quiet Creek Motel. Its old neon sign flickered as it was partially illuminated against the dark evening sky. This was my first time being in Montana, and unfortunately, my first impression, despite the gorgeous mountains in the distance, was rather forgettable. Granted, I had been driving all day, after being told last minute by my boss that I needed to head north to work on down power lines. That would put anyone in a bad mood. To be fair, my company had just upgraded my work truck to a new full cab. That and my company would cover lodging and food while I was away, although it appeared that there weren't many options in terms for lodging. I walked into the office where the check-in desk sat vacant. The interior looked as if they tried for an outdoorsy rustic look, but ultimately fell short, giving it a cheap hunter's vibe. On the furthest wall facing in was a small television playing reruns of an old sitcom from the 70s. Sitting on the counter was an old key with a key tag that had the number 7 on it and a piece of paper underneath. I waited briefly for an attendant to come to the desk, but noticed that my company's logo was on the paper and my name on the heading. It was a receipt showing that I was staying here 3 nights and that everything had already been paid for. Not the first time I'd been set up beforehand, but normally I had to at least talk to someone first to confirm everything. I double-checked the dates and the card on file just to make sure that no problem would arise in the future. I grabbed my key and the receipt and left the office. Besides not having to speak to anyone, this was nothing out of the ordinary. I walked back out to the truck and parked closer to the room that I'd be staying in. The new car smell still hung in the truck. Plastic film still on parts of the upholstery I'd yet to take off. I parked out in front of room 7 and got out. The cool night air blew harshly as I tried my best to unlock the door. I noticed 2 other cars in the parking lot, which made me feel better that I wasn't the only one staying here. It was rather strange how there was very little nearby. Across the street of the motel was a large field, but a ways off, the road seemed to bend around and a gas station could be seen, right before the mountains spread into the distance. I finally got the door unlocked and went inside. The interior was pretty standard for a motel room. 2 queen-size beds, a random chair that sat in the corner, a small flat-screen TV that had the logo of the motel on some kind of home screen. I brought my stuff inside, putting my luggage on the extra bed and locked the door behind me. I noticed that the room had another door that accessed an adjoining room next to it, which I made sure to confirm was locked. I turned off the TV on my way to the bathroom and did my business. I got ready for bed and fought the urge for one last cigarette, but lost. I found myself walking out to the parking lot to fetch my smokes inside the truck. Normally I just smoke inside the truck, but this was a new one, and my boss would tan my hide if I would be the one to smoke in it. It was cold out, and the wind blew stronger than in most places. I could hear the faint whistling of the tall grass in the field across the street. I closed the truck door while stuffing my pack in my jacket pocket while fumbling for my lighter. I made my way towards the other end of the parking lot, the gravel crunching with each step. The night sky was bare. No influence or constraints of light pollution can be seen, as the universe appeared to bear itself from above. The Milky Way was distant yet made an appearance, something I hadn't seen for years. Its faint milky color spread in the vast night, giving the impression that, perhaps, there was in fact a divine creator after all. The sky preoccupied me, until I realized I had not only crossed the parking lot, but reached the grass barrier that separated it from the road. I lit my cigarette and let my mind wander as I glanced across the field and saw the quaint gas station. The wind came in spurts, biting my neck each time. I ducked my head into my coat, averting my gaze when I noticed what appeared to be a set of green eyes reflecting from the motel's lights. I felt in my pocket for the small flashlight I carried and pulled it out and flipped it on in one swift motion. The eyes appeared again, but were now accompanied with multiple sets, Deer, I thought. They normally travel in groups and wander in fields for food. They were off a ways, about half a mile if I had to guess. I shined my light around just out of curiosity when my light fell on another set of eyes that were much closer. This set confused me as I could almost make out its form that sat just across the street. These eyes were red, a color I didn't think an animal could possess. I stood upright and found myself stepping closer to get a better look. My light grew stronger with each step, slowly revealing a form that looked crouched. I kept walking until I felt the hard pavement of the road under my step, catching me off guard. This startled whatever I was looking at, and the eyes stood up. This was much taller than what I thought it was, certainly something I had yet to come across in person. I wanted to get closer, but I felt a sense of dread peering at me from those eyes, as if I was in the presence of a predator. I stepped back and made sure to keep a visual on the eyes as I made my way back to the safety of the parking lot. But with each back step, the tall set of eyes seemed to be getting closer, matching my pace. I stopped. This thing, whatever it was stalking me. I made a quick glance back to my room and realized I had a whole parking lot to clear before I was safe. A distance I wasn't sure I could make it if it came down to a sprint. I just kept my eyes on the thing as I backpedaled slowly across the parking lot. I was nearly at my truck when the parking lot lights reached far enough to where the eyes formed around a hideous figure, causing me to stop. It stood briefly in the light and quickly stepped back out into the darkness. It had happened so quickly that my mind couldn't process what I was looking at. But what I did know was that it was tall and looked human. I went into my room and locked the door. I don't think it mattered, but the thought did briefly come into my mind about not letting this thing know which room I was staying in, but I wasn't thinking properly. I looked out the people to see if this thing stepped into the light again, but it didn't. I lost sight of it in the endless darkness, which was now midnight. I tried to calm myself, but my mind was wide awake. Completely aware now, as if I knew something was wrong, as if my safety was at risk. I turned the TV on and picked a random channel to help relax, but my ears would prick up at the slightest sound outside. It happened twice. The first were footsteps, but sounded like they belonged to someone that was staying here. A quick pace past my door towards the front office. The second noise was something unaccounted for. I had turned off the TV at this point. The lights from the parking lot still spilled in from under the door and from the corners of the curtain. I liked to sleep on my left side, which had caused me to face away from the door, but the softest of tapping could be heard from the front door. 3 brief taps on the door, as if with the tip of a fingernail, ever so slightly, applied on the exterior of the door. My eyes shot open. I leaned back, looking over my right shoulder at the door. Unsure if I would soon be accompanied with an unwanted guest or if it was just a trick of the wind, I waited what felt like hours in the darkness. The only comfort was that the other bed had separated me from the door, giving me the faintest of barriers. I normally carry a gun, but that was something I had forgotten due to the late notice of this trip. I sat there, unarmed, cloaked in darkness, just waiting. I wanted to readjust in bed, but I felt that if I moved or made any audible sound, then I would provide proof that I was in here, and my late-night guest would invite himself in. I don't remember falling asleep, but the sound of my phone alarm woke me up. The events of last night had been washed away by a night of poor sleep. I had a busy day. I needed to get up and start it on the power line so I could get home sooner, hopefully. The day went by surprisingly slow. Normally working hard makes time fly, but the brutal cold seemed to make it drag on. I grabbed dinner in town and took my time coming back to the motel. As night came, the events of the night previous had slowly crawled to the forefront of my mind. Pulling into the parking lot, I had noticed the same 2 cars from the night previous, but I still hadn't actually seen anyone. I went to the front office to make sure that everything was in order, but to also confirm I wasn't actually out here alone. I was more frustrated than worried. Who runs a motel that has no employees ever on site? I walked back to my room and noticed that the room next to mine, room 6, was left ajar. The lights inside were off, but I was tempted to peek inside to confirm that someone was out here with me, but I feared that this would cause more problems if I got caught. I did my best to look in while I passed, but it was too dark inside to see any luggage. The 2 cars gave very little hints of where anyone was staying, as one was by the office and the other was on the other side of the parking lot. It was so old and neglected that it even looked abandoned. The open door bothered me, so much so that I even moved my luggage from the spare queen bed to in front of the interior connecting doors. I knew it was locked, but it gave that extra weight to give me peace of mind, perhaps buying me a few precious seconds if something were to happen. The second night, despite my urges, I decided against the smoke break. Something about this place was off, and I didn't want to be outside if I didn't have to. My room provided a small sanctuary that I could control, and my truck was right outside if I needed a quick getaway. Partway through the evening, before I considered going to bed, I heard the sound of the door of the room next to me close, as if someone had just came back. I could hear movement inside, typical of someone unwinding for the night. For once, the noise of a neighbor gave me peace, just the reassurance I wasn't out here alone in this godforsaken motel. But as I listened, that reassurance slowly faded. I could hear whoever's on the other side talk, but no one ever answered. I couldn't ever make out words, so I don't know what they were saying. I tried to rationalize that they could have been on the phone, but they soon started moaning, as if they were in pain or mourning something. It was lower pitch, most likely a man. It wasn't long before the sound of the door opened again, and someone walked out. I rushed to the door and peered out the peephole to confirm my suspicions of the man, but I didn't see anyone. Not even a car parked out front of the motel room. The thought did cross my mind that it could have been a ghost or something, but I never did find those to be scary. I went back to laying on my bed watching TV when I heard the definite sound of someone knocking on my door. "Room service," someone said, muffled on the other side of the door. I checked my phone and saw that it was 9 o'clock. Did they say room service? This late at night? At a motel? Something was off. I looked at the door confused before getting up and walking over. I had both locks on the door, even the one that allows you to crack it open, but I instinctively peered through the peephole to see whoever was on the other side. Whoever it was blocking it with their hand. I wanted to open the door, but my body froze in that moment. I couldn't even ask who was out there. They knocked again, but much harder this time, and without speaking. The door rattled faintly from the force. Something bad was on the other side. I was sure of it. I stepped back and anticipated another knock, waiting for the door to erupt in kicks and blows, but it went silent again. I was unsure of what to do. The room's only entrance seemed to be guarded by someone trying desperately to get in. I picked up the old phone on the nightstand and pressed 2 for the front office. A pleasant yet outdated hold music played as I waited. A loud single bang startled me from the front door. I walked over and peered through the peephole while still on the phone, and I was now able to see into the parking lot this time. The coast looked clear. Nothing was outside, at least in the small field of vision that the peephole allowed. I did notice something though. Something about my truck that made me pause for concern. On the windshield and parts of the hood there appeared to be a brown and red mass that I couldn't comprehend. Some type of obstruction, perhaps. I could hear the neighboring room door open and shuffling next door. Banging erupted from the conjoining door, causing my luggage to fall over. I dropped the phone. I did the only thing I could think to do and opened the door and made a mad dash to my truck. Greeting me immediately outside was the crushed skull of a female deer. Its head splattered on the motel door. What remained of the deer was on my windshield. Its carcass had been torn and twisted, bones sticking out. Its flesh were in the beginning stages of rot. The initial sight had caused me to pause, but the commotion inside my motel room reminded me of the situation. I ran to the driver's side door and entered the truck. My first instinct was to lock the truck and then start it. The windshield had been obscured by the deer carcass, but I put the truck in reverse and punched it. Most of what was on my windshield had smeared across. I angled the truck hard to the right so I had a clear view of my motel room through the passenger side window. I could see inside my room as something now stood in what was once my doorway. The red eyes glared at me. The tall, pale body of what was once human stood crouching, its gaze burned with hatred. We connected, a predator and its prey acknowledging that only a few seconds in misfortune had separated them from encountering. I continued to watch as I saw a toothy smile slowly spread across its face, and the door to my motel room slowly closing. They say that knowledge is power, but sometimes things are better left unknown. The bustling police station was full of chatter and commotion as Officer Whitfield walked in. He was once one of those officers that would show up first thing, ready to take on the day, but the job had slowly worn him down. His morale slowly decayed the more exposed he was to human nature. The police force was his idea of making a positive change for the world, but after seeing all the horrors mankind was capable of, he wasn't even sure he was making a difference. He walked over to his desk and tossed his empty coffee cup in the trash, surprised to see a priest sitting on the other end of his desk. "Can I help you?" he said as he sat down facing him. The priest had a look of concern on his face. He was clearly conflicted as he was fidgeting with his hands, but smiled. "Yes, I'm Father Alquist. I have a matter I was hoping you could help me with. I would like to do a wellness check to one of my followers." Whitfield sat back in his chair. "A wellness check? That's doable. You don't have to be here for that. Why didn't you just call it in?" Father Alquist sat upright. His tone and countenance became more serious. "Well, I would like to accompany you, if that's possible. The man I would like to check on had confessed some things to me, and although he didn't say it outright, I think he might have committed some kind of crime. I'm not supposed to report these kind of things unless it's serious, and I'm completely sure, but I think a wellness check would be appropriate." Whitfield nodded. He sat upright in his chair and began taking notes. "Sure, I understand where you're coming from. What did he say that made you think he's into something?" The priest began to fidget with his hands more as he thought hard on what he could share. He said something about finding a manifested evil and how he serves it. He does its bidding and provides its offspring with flesh. Whitfield looked up from his notes, giving the priest a look of speculation. Giving its offspring flesh? Are those his exact words? The priest nodded and looked down. "I know. I just think that a wellness check is warranted," he said somberly. Whitfield smiled. He wanted to press him for more information, but figured it'd just be redundant, seeing that he was going to see this guy anyways. Not the best way to start the day, but it beats doing paperwork. "I'll tell you what, it's definitely worth a checkup if you hadn't seen him in a while, and seeing how you could be seen as a community leader and have given him counsel, you're more than welcome to join us." Whitfield leaned over to one of the nearby desks. Bradley, you up for a wellness check?" The young officer looked towards the two, confused but agreed. "Great. Let's go check up on your churchgoer." The three left the station fairly early in the day. Father Alquist had the address and attempted to visit a few times, but he never answered. The morning was fairly bleak, but that was typical for the Seattle skyline. It looked like it was going to rain something fierce later, but for now only seldom drops seemed to fall. They left the city and made their way to a smaller town on the outskirts, a town that Whitfield and Bradley had passed but never had entered. The homes were fairly small and mostly run down. They pulled into the driveway of one of the homes where a car was already sitting outside. The priest got out and the two officers followed him up to the front door and knocked. There was no answer. Whitfield glanced at the window next to the door and noticed that there were dozens of flies. The priest knocked several times but no result. He went to knock again, but Whitfield grabbed him gently and moved him away from the door. "We need to get inside," he whispered to Bradley, pointing to the window. Whitfield tried the handle, but it was locked. He barged it a few times with his shoulder, but the door didn't move. Whitfield began to kick on the door, and after a handful of times, the frame finally gave in, and it opened. They were greeted with a dark home. Had it not been for the car parked in the driveway, it was likely that this person wasn't even here. Before the men could step inside, the three noticed a bizarre odor. The smell was horrid. Even in the mild temperature, the rancid smell stifled the home. Whitfield had smelt this before, and knew that they were in for a horrible discovery. The three men silently knew what they were going to find, or at least they thought they did. The home was modest. Nothing really stood out in regards to furniture or appliances. In the living room was a computer that was still on. Its glow illuminated a small section of the area, casting gruesome shadows in every direction. The priest flipped the light on to reveal what everyone had feared. The living room came to life, but revealed a scene of sadness and gore. They could tell almost immediately what had happened, seeing how the scene told a story of frantic delusions and an unfortunate result. Next to the computer desk, sat leaning against the wall, was what was left of the priest's friend. A shotgun sat next to him, as the recoil slightly distanced itself from its user. His shirt was stained, a reddish brown, and covered the wall and ceiling. Aside from the neck and jaw, very little remained on his head. On the wall behind him, aside from the stains, were frantic writings, phrases and symbols reflecting that this was a disturbed individual. Something was clearly tormenting him mentally. The priest was visibly shaken as he began to motion some religious symbol and muttered softly a kind of prayer. Bradley drew his weapon as a reflex, as he was clearly startled. But Whitfield, he was calm. "Is this what you were fearing?" he asked the priest. The priest was silent but nodded. The priest began to get closer to the body, reaching out as if he was about to touch it, before Bradley stopped him. "I'm sorry, Father, but we can't have you tampering with evidence." Whitfield called in on the radio for backup and for a forensic team when he saw something. A corkboard next to the computer. It was of a map, the town that they were in, he assumed. There was a red yarn spanning across it with circles and Polaroid pictures of distant blurry figures. Next to the map were 3 driver's licenses of 3 young women tacked onto the board. 2 of the 3 Whitfield recognized immediately. They were women that had been missing for the last year. Everything else on the board was hand-drawn pictures of tall, twisted figures with their faces scratched out. Some of the drawn pictures were in great detail, with mysterious symbols on the paper. One symbol was prevalent and was frequently used. It was also marked on the map of the town. Whitfield stepped back from the wall and read some of the ramblings in hopes for clues, but it all seemed like nonsense. Tormented ideas of those plagued by madness. He had no hopes of trying to understand what seemed like gibberish, had it not been for the missing girls. The idea began to itch his brain, that if he could make sense of whatever this was, it could very well lead to the missing girls. There were a handful of phrases in English, and despite the poor handwriting, he was able to understand. "The black goat of the wood commands me. Its hunger knows no end. She has denied my last offering." The phrases of these unusual writings caught Whitfield's attention. It was clear that the author was both misguided and insane. But the context of the three phrases began to trouble him. Bradley escorted the priest out while Whitfield stayed inside. He stayed in the living room, looking at the board, speculating until backup came. During that time, he was able to deduce that whoever this was had abducted these girls, but nothing in the writing or material said anything about killing them, just giving them to some strange cult or entity that this guy was trying to appease. There was still hope, at least for the girls. Typically, this type of scene is cut and dry, but to the trained eye, this raised more questions than it did answers. Why was this person compelled to such a drastic end? Where were the missing girls? And what was he referring to? There was a strange symbol highlighted on the map of the town. Most of the yarn was pointed here. This is where he'd find any of the girls, or what was left of them. As Whitfield waited for backup, he felt a strange sensation about the writings. Even though he couldn't understand most of it, he could have sworn he heard the faintest of whisperings, speaking in what he could imagine to be an ancient tongue. He could feel his mind slowly shift, ever so slightly, like as if he could feel the earth beneath him rotate. Had anything else were to happen around him, he wouldn't have noticed it. But seeing how he was all alone with the writings and this gruesome corpse, his senses were able to pick up on this otherworldly sensation. Before too much could happen, backup arrived and snapped him back to this terrible scene. Although the bloody and recently decayed body was the first thing to greet him, it was much better than what his mind was beginning to anticipate. Whitfield left the home as the police were taping off the scene. Bradley was leaning against the cruiser in the driveway. The two hopped in the cruiser and took off into the town. I think this guy's been taking girls and dumping them somewhere. Whether they're alive or deceased is another story. I think he was offering them to something, perhaps a group of traffickers or even a higher power. Guessing from the frantic writings, he was either on hyperactive drugs or perhaps some kind of paranoid delusion, which are my guesses, Whitfield said. Bradley looked confused, slowly shifting into dismay as the two drove across town. Whitfield had taken several photos on his phone before leaving, one of which was of the map that he was now using as a reference for their next stop. It didn't take long for Whitfield to pull into the old parking lot that was next to the mall. The building was much older, but surprisingly it was still open. A few dozen cars could be seen as a light rain began to fall. Dark clouds could no longer hold back their moisture as faint rumblings of thunder rolled in the distance. The style of mall was very much 80s and quite large. It didn't look like it had been updated since. The two officers were able to park fairly close and went inside. Once inside, an eerie sense of abandonment was prevalent. Even its smell seemed dated and neglected. Some of the stores were open, although they looked barely staffed. The remaining storefronts were dark and had metal gates pulled down, preventing anyone from going inside. The officers realized that the mall was unique, and that although the mall was a single story, a second story could be seen below when they reached the center of the mall. The stairs to the lower levels had been blocked by previous renovations, making it impossible for anyone to successfully get down below. The glass elevators still remained, but were no longer in use. The lower levels beneath them gave off a haunting presence, as if ghosts of past stores and customers lingered in the shadows below. It was clear to Whitfield that this mall played a part in the girls' missing cases, but he wasn't clear on what part that was. Did the guy take them from here? Did he see them here and follow them home? Or did he perhaps work here? They walked around in hopes of seeing something to connect the girls to the crime scene, but nothing stood out, at least in regards to the case. The two officers went into some of the shops and asked around, but the employees were just as clueless. Bradley checked the time. It was 3 o'clock. They had been here for around an hour and had gotten nowhere. Maybe it's time to call it. We've looked everywhere, he said as Whitfield walked. His pace slowed and he rested on the handrails overlooking the lower levels. The two looked down below and then back at each other. "We haven't checked everywhere." The two officers asked around for who was in charge of the mall and were finally connected with a small man with glasses. His demeanor was overly positive. The two introduced themselves briefly before telling the supervisor that they would need access to the lower levels for a quick inspection. His joyful expression slowly faded. "Why do you need to go down there? It's just a bunch of old empty shops," he asked. "We have reason to believe that this mall is connected to a current investigation. We need to check every inch of it just to be sure." The stark contrast between the supervisor's attitudes were startling, but he slowly reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a key card. He handed it over to Whitfield as he pulled out his walkie-talkie and called over someone from security. His smile quickly returned. "Of course. Here's my all-access card. This should give you access to every inch of this place." A heavy-set man in his late 30s slowly approached. He had a patchy beard and a dirty uniform. He had a key ring with several different keys, but notably no weapon. "This is Jeremy, my head of security. He will escort you around and help facilitate anything you need." He nodded his head unenthusiastically and raised his hand silently. The supervisor beckoned them to follow him, and all four of them walked to the back office. Once back there, he guided them to the back door, which Jeremy walked over and reached for his keys, which he used to unlock the door. He opened the door to a dark stairway that had a metal set of stairs leading down. "This is the only working set of stairs that will lead you down to the bottom floor. You'll not find much down there." The supervisor checked his watch and asked Jeremy to lock up, as he was now leaving for the night. Jeremy nodded and turned on his flashlight and walked down the set of stairs. The two officers thanked him as they followed the security guard down the dark steps. The stairwell led them down 2 flights of stairs. At the bottom, light could be seen spilling in from the open area. The bottom area was abandoned, but still clean. Hollow stores were closed, some with metal gates that peered from the darkness. Stains of where logos once hung haunted the front of stores. Dated carpet laid lifelessly inside like a rotted tongue from inside a skull. Faint music from above could still be heard, as if they were in a diluted version of the mall. Plastic plants and old advertisements decorated the bottom level, but sparsely, like a faint pulse barely beating. Jeremy stood by the stairs while both officers went their separate ways, doing their due diligence before leaving this godforsaken mall. Whitfield walked by the entrances of the stores, slowly shining his flashlight inside as it briefly scanned the abandoned stores. Empty shelves and fallen carts were the only things to greet him. On the seldom occasion of a gated store, he'd reached out briefly to ensure its gates were locked. A slight banging of metal clanged as the gates resisted his checks. In one of the corners near the end of his route, he reached out to one of the gates. His fingers reached in between the bars and lifted expectantly the same sound and resistance, but this time, it slid open. Interesting. He pulled up harder, and sure enough, the gate lifted more. Probably just an error of whoever locked up last down here, he thought. He lifted the gate over his head and he stood outside and peered in. This store looked different. Many clear tarps hung from the ceiling, as if they tried painting this place or even remodeled it right when it shut down. The tarps prevented his vision from seeing all the way inside. Whitfield stood there briefly, almost ready to close the gate again, but something about this place scratched at the base of his skull. He had nothing other than a bad feeling to go off of, this mall included. There was a good chance that he was wasting his and Bradley's time, but the mixture of curiosity and dread whispered for him to go inside. He glanced back briefly to Bradley, who was at the other end of the mall, and went inside. He pulled back some of the tarps as he went in. The smell of old drywall and dust hovered in the air. The light from outside quickly was smothered by the many layers of tarps, making his flashlight shine brighter the further he went inside. Tools and materials laid about, as if forgotten. The feeling of dread began to softly build. His attention began to focus as he neared the end of the store. He could feel himself grabbing his pistol, but not yet pulling it from its holster. On the back wall, letters and symbols crudely written by hand that had since dried resembled the same writings of that corkboard from the house. Not only that, but the same symbol that was frequently seen was written above an open doorway that led to more stairs. The faint whisperings in Whitfield's head made a brief yet noticeable appearance, reminding him of that horrific episode back at the house was anything but an accident. He could feel his grip on sanity lighten very briefly before taking a step back and calling for Bradley. Bradley and the security guard approached not much later. By this time, Whitfield had taken several steps back from the writings, but still stood silently in the dark room. Bradley and Jeremy approached Whitfield while looking at the wall where his light rested. It was now clear. The mall and the suspects were now connected, but the real question was, what more were they going to find? "Where does this lead?" Whitfield said, while keeping his attention on the writings in front of him. Jeremy paused, but eventually fumbled out some answer, revealing his ignorance. I'm not sure. I've never been allowed down here before." The three stood in awe as the dark doorway stood before them. Although they had permission to search the premises and even being accompanied by a security guard, this doorway felt forbidden, as if this was the only thing keeping them away from an unmistakable evil. Time seemed to crawl slowly, as none of them wanted to be here, especially to go further into the dark. Bradley finally moved over to Whitfield and spoke softly, as if to exclude Jeremy. "Shall we call this in? Maybe get some backup on this?" Whitfield declined. "Nah, we got it. We'll just take a quick peek." Overhead, an intercom could be heard out in the main area, saying that the mall would be closing in the next 10 minutes. The three looked at each other. "We only need 5, Whitfield said, as if to overcome any of Jeremy's objections to going down the stairs. The three pressed on and entered the doorway. The metallic stairs led down further. The stairway appeared as if this could have once been a common area for those to enter, since it was wide and resembled much of the other parts of the mall. Once at the bottom, darkness seemed to take on a higher calling. All of their flashlights seemed to be smothered, to only allow a couple of feet of visibility. From what they could tell, this looked like another level of the mall, although concealed and barren. The area was quite large, and due to the poor visibility, it would take them much longer than normal to check everything out. "Let's come back to this. This will take us much longer than I thought," Whitfield said. Before Bradley could respond, movement could be heard in the darkness, a shuffling somewhere deep in the unknown. The three quickly shared a glance as if they had to check it out, seeing that they should be the only ones down here. "Who's there?" Jeremy cried, fear evident in his voice. The two officers began to slowly walk towards the sound, each of them drawing their pistols. The whisperings came back for Whitfield, but unlike before, the voices slowly began to make sense. The indecipherable words slowly started coming in as English. They were faint at first, and he tried to push them to the back of his mind as he stepped further into the darkness, but the voices seemed to multiply. With each additional voice, the volume slowly began to rise. He tried to stay focused, but his mind was being overwhelmed by dark words. "She sees you. Join us and you'll be spared. Deny your flesh and take on her image." He stopped walking and grabbed his head as he tried to relieve the pressure that was building inside. Bradley spoke, but with fear. "Did you see that?" he said, as he pointed his flashlight into the darkness, his pistol raised and ready to fire. The voices stopped and Whitfield was relieved of his trance. He was given a brief moment of clarity as he stood up. Bradley's flashlight rested on a distant wall of the floor where they were just at. As they slowly closed the distance, a horrifying figure could be seen coming into the view of the light. The two stopped when they realized that the figure that they saw was both far too tall and significantly disfigured. Had it not been walking upright, one could confuse it as anything but human. Its features were crude and unsettling, as if a less divine figure tried to replicate the human form, but wasn't bothered by beauty. Bradley shined his light all around to try to capture the figure again, but was only met with the empty mall. The setting seemed to change. The two officers were now on high alert, as it was clear that they were in the presence of some kind of humanoid predator. Was this figure the thing the priest friend was sacrificing the girls to? Some kind of demonic entity summoned from another realm? The two conjectured mentally as to what was going on before a scream echoed from behind them. It was clear that Jeremy was in some kind of distress. Bradley couldn't help but point his flashlight away from where they last saw the monster in hopes of seeing Jeremy, but he was too far away. Jeremy's flashlight could be seen in the distance, but it was moving so frantically that they couldn't tell of his condition. In his panic, Bradley started to run towards him. Whitfield tried to keep up, but the voices came back, stronger and clearer.
You have been chosen. Worship and you'll be amongst the spared. I will exalt your flesh. Answer the call of the Tapahedron.
Images slowly began to fill his mind. Dark clouds seemed to form on a bleak horizon. Whitfield seemed to be coming in and out of consciousness, between dimensions of reality of his mind. He lost grasp of time as he would briefly come to and find himself more and more separated from the other two men. In front of him would appear the monstrous creature, but it seemed that they kept their distance while watching, as if they were guiding him with a small sense of fear in their duties. Their appearance was more clear now that he could see them fully in between the trances. Their heads seemed to be elongated, with rows of teeth spilling from their vile maws. Their figures resembled human but far more alien, almost as if they were horrifying imitations. They snarled and drooled in the darkness, their eyes fixed on the officer as he walked unwillingly to a secret chamber. His mind seemed to break as mentally he witnessed the form of thick clouds that slowly took form of a goat's head, and many tentacles that wormed hideously behind it. In many voices it spoke, but not externally.
I call you to the priest amongst my children.
Whitfield flashed back to reality, only for a moment, to see a terrifying horde of monsters watching him from the darkness, their eyes fixed in anticipation. He flashed back to the cloud, this time more clearer. Its grotesque features of decayed flesh seemed to expand and form a terrifying storm of this cosmic entity. A black head of a goat with the many horns twisted in oral fashion focused in on him.
Grab the stone and be exalted.
He flashed back to the mall, but was now in a chamber of utter horror. An altar sat in front of him, several paces. Human bodies laid splayed, including those of Bradley and Jeremy. Their limbs were ripped and pulled as their torsos laid spilled and opened, almost as if in artistic fashion, forming what could only be assumed a dark version of sacred geometry. Surprisingly, Bradley and Jeremy were still alive. The altar was surrounded by symbols and flesh, most of which were decayed, but the new additions of Jeremy and Bradley provided the slightest vibrance of color. The missing girls were amongst the bodies, but in a morbid sense of mercy, they were long since been deceased. In the middle of the altar floated a dark stone of mysterious craftsmanship. It pulsated as it slowly rotated, revealing many sides which had smaller symbols and red striations. Dark energy undulated from it, bending time and space in the process. The many creatures began to chant as Bradley watched from his horrible fate. Whitfield's eyes were black and dark liquid spilled from it. "Whitfield, help us!" Bradley cried as he writhed in pain, but his cries didn't register on the possessed Whitfield. Jeremy could only scream in pain and horror as his fate was clear to him. Whitfield approached the altar, but when he reached it, he had snapped out of his trance for good. His mind was clear, his faculties in complete control. He stood before the stone, The creature's utterly silent, watching to see what he would do. Bradley continued to plead for mercy, causing Whitfield to turn away from the stone. The monsters began to snarl in disapproval, making it clear to refrain from helping them. His only option was to touch the stone. He had been controlled up to this point, but was now in a clear state of mind. It was as if he had to do this last part willingly. His safety was at stake, but so was his soul. He knew that touching the stone would seal his fate, but so would deviating from the ritual. He shook with fear as his pulse raced, his mind filled with terror and panic. The stone, as horrific as it looked, also had an appealing quality to it. The more he looked at it, the more it compelled him to know more. He reached his hand towards it, the warm waves of energy greeting him the closer he got. Bradley watched as he grasped the stone and began to shake violently while screaming. His voice began to fry and his body violently spasmed to the point that Bradley was sure he was dying. Whitfield had stopped briefly and stood upright, holding the stone with both hands above his head. He then said, with a voice not his own,
"Yah, Shabnagoreth, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young."
The multitude of creatures replicated his posture, lifting their claws in the air while repeating,
"Yah, Shabnagoreth, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young."
I should have known better. Driving in the dead of night down a dark ribbon of asphalt is enough to put anyone to sleep. Add in the complete lack of scenery, unless you count the countless rows of giant corn stalks that flank both sides of the road. I don't know how they make them grow so tall. Maybe they put something special in the fertilizer. But in any case, rows upon rows of corn with nary a break in sight for miles can make me go a special kind of crazy. That is, if I can keep my eyes open long enough. Wish there was some other way for me to get home at night. Any other way, but there isn't. I live at the far end of the road, surrounded by cornfields. Going faster wasn't an option. With the corn so close to the road, I had no warning if a suicidal deer jumped out in front of me. Believe me, I had plenty of those. Fortunately, I kept to my own personal speed limit of 40 miles an hour. It helped me to avoid making a fur hood ornament out of many a deer, not to mention the other creatures that seemed to think that they owned the road. My car was a factor too. At this point, I'm not sure if it would tolerate going much faster than 40. The engine light had gone on around a month ago, but I didn't have the time or the money to get it to a garage. I just prayed every time I turned the key that it would start and get me home or to work, depending on what time of day or night it was. Those were the only places I went anymore, home and work. Occasionally I'd stop after work and get some groceries, but that was it. When you work at a factory like me, that seemed to think that you're just another machine that they could run as much as they wanted. Home and work was all your life consisted of. This night I'd be especially glad to get home. My feet were killing me and I was exhausted. I was due back to work in less than 12 hours and needed to get gas as much as I needed to sleep. Not that any of that was a rare occurrence. My feet were always killing me, and I was always exhausted. Even on my days off, all I did was sleep, trying to catch up from a week of working 12-hour days. The corn seemed to be blurrier than usual tonight, and I caught my eyes going closer more than a few times. I woke up to the sound of metal grinding and lights flashing on my dashboard as the car lurched to a stop. There was no time to pull over. It was grounded to a halt in the middle of the road. Futilely, I tried to start it more than a few times, only to be rewarded by the sound of metal grinding against metal. "No, no, no, no," I said. "Please don't do this to me." It ignored my pleas. Closing my eyes, I turned the key one last time, praying for a miracle. The engine didn't even click. It was done. I smacked my head on the steering wheel in frustration, not doing any damage to the wheel, but starting me on a headache. The headlights were still lit, but just beyond their dying dirty yellow glow, the overwhelming darkness closed in. Taking a moment to gather my thoughts, I realized I was at least 10 or more miles from home. My feet were still hurting from work, and even resting them as I sat in the car wasn't comfortable. I didn't relish the idea of walking, let alone for miles. It was a little after 3 in the morning. Even if I was able to afford a AAA, no one was going to drive out here this late at night. For a brief moment, I thought about sleeping in the car, but there was always a chance of being run over by one of the tractor trailers that hauled corn from the local farms that surrounded me. Dying in an accident because I was too stupid to get out of the road would just be my luck. I decided to avoid that scenario, as much as I hated the thought. I'd have to walk home. Grabbing my work bag and my flashlight out of the glove compartment, I turned on the hazard blinkers and got out of the car, knowing it'd be the last time. I only hoped I'd get some trade-in value for when it was time to buy a used car I couldn't afford. But with my luck, the dealership would probably charge me more to tow it than give me trade-in on it. Not bothering to look back, I turned on the flashlight and started walking. Pain shot through my feet and went up through my legs with every step. After 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped and sat in the grass on the side of the road, digging through my work bag for the bottle of ibuprofen that I carried and used every day. Fortunately, there was enough water left in my bottle to wash down 3 of the pills. It took every ounce of my willpower to get up and start walking again. The pain hadn't gone away. It had gotten worse. I silently prayed that the medicine would kick in soon. Trying to focus on something, anything other than my feet, my flashlight swept back and forth across the road, sometimes catching the edge of the cornfields. It wasn't supposed to be cold today. The temperature was in the low 60s this afternoon, yet for some reason, I caught a chill as I walked. I guess I hadn't planned on walking home tonight. It had been warm enough that I hadn't even brought a jacket to work. Now I regret that decision. As if reading my mind, the wind picked up, sending a gust my way, causing me to shiver. What's next, a rainstorm? I thought. I looked up to the pitch-black sky with not a single star in sight, waiting for the impromptu shower that was sure to come. That was the way my luck was running. As I waited for the downpour, I trudged on, each step delivering pain. I wished there was a way to prove that the company was at fault, sue them and retire, but I knew that there was no proof. Others before me had gone through the same thing, and none of them had any proof either. They just slowly disappeared one by one. Management found some excuse to fire them, and since the company was such a large employer in the town, the fired person was also blacklisted. I know they say blacklists don't exist. Tell that to the people that were fired and weren't even given unemployment because the company didn't want to pay for it, so they bullied the people into keeping their mouths shut. If only I could get another job, but the company was the highest paying around, by a slim margin. That's why they built their factory in a depressed area. No competition. And no one could afford to take even a minor pay cut with the way insurance costs were, not to mention such frivolous things like food. As depressing as the thoughts were, they distracted me from the pain in my feet and legs as I walked down the road, hugging myself, trying to keep the flashlight pointed ahead, shivering from the wind. As my shaking hand made the light jump all around, I saw a set of eyes peek out of the cornfield ahead of me, then dart back in and disappeared. At first I thought it might have been a dog or a cat, but it seemed too big to be either of those. That thought concerned me. Having something bigger than a dog peeking out of the cornfield at me when I was miles away from any help or shelter wasn't high up on my to-do list at the moment. But the fact that it ducked back into the field gave me a boost of confidence, knowing that it was more afraid of me than I was of it. When I got to the point where the animal had peeked out, I slowed and shone my light into the impenetrable curtain of corn stalks. There were no eyes and nothing jumped out at me, so I shrugged and continued my painful march towards my home. The wind whipping through the corn stalks sounded like a rainstorm. It made me feel even colder, if that was possible. 15 minutes later, I took another rest break. At least the wind was dying down. With literally miles to go before I sleep, I was taking comfort in anything I could. After my break, getting up was harder. The pain had gotten worse instead of better. I didn't even want to think of the blisters forming on my feet, or how I was going to get to work later on that day. It didn't matter if you'd never taken a sick day in your life. The company did everything they could to make you feel like a piece of crap for even attempting to call off. I truly believe if I went to work with a severed arm, bleeding all over, they'd hand me a mop and tell me to get to work. As my hopelessness and bitterness fought over which felt more justified, I heard something behind me. It sounded like the cornstalks rustling, so I ignored it as the wind and kept walking. The next problem my mind decided to torture me with was my car. How was I going to get to work without a car? And how was I going to afford a car if I couldn't get to work? A wonderful conundrum I would have to solve later today. As I wrestled with that problem, I heard the cornstalks rustle again. I stopped and looked around. The wind had died down and the air was still. None of the stalks were moving. In fact, it had become eerily quiet. I shone my flashlight into the corn, doing a slow turn to search for whatever had made the noise, but I didn't see anything. Not entirely satisfied, I turned and started walking again. It wasn't long before I heard the rustle. This time I didn't stop, and neither did it. I went a little faster. So did the noise. I broke into a run and the noise kept pace with me. I skidded to a stop, nearly stumbling. The noise in the cornfield stopped as well. There was no doubt about it. Something was following me. It also was keeping pace with me. It was stalking me. I turned around the field and shone my light into the wall of green. The wind was still there and there was no movement. I could feel the stillness. The chill I felt no longer had anything to do with the temperature. I wanted to see what was following me, but at the same time I didn't want to know. Out here in the middle of nowhere, I was on my own and didn't like my chances fighting off a predator. There was nothing I could do about it. The closest thing I had to a weapon to defend myself was my flashlight, and I was sure that it wouldn't do much against a determined predator. For a fleeting moment, my mind thought, you know what? Bring it on. At least if something attacks me and kills me, I won't have to deal with walking miles on feet that feel like razor blades or tearing them slowly to pieces. It's awesome to realize that your mind is actively trying to kill you. With nothing left to do but walk, that's exactly what I did, trying my best to ignore the pain as well as the disturbing feeling in the back of my mind that I was being hunted. As soon as I started, the sound started beside me. I did my best to ignore it, shooting furtive glances into the cornfield now and then didn't have any results at first, but after a few minutes, I noticed I could see something pale through the corn. It was walking next to me in the first row of corn, maybe trying to get a feel for what I was. Funny thing was, that's exactly what I was trying to do. Stopping and ripping open the layer of corn stalks was the last resort. I didn't want to spook this thing into attacking. For the time being, I began thinking of it as my walking buddy, my companion on the dark night with only a flashlight to keep me company. Thinking that helped me keep the fear at bay. I had no sooner thought it until a light appeared on the road in the distance. I watched with great curiosity as it came closer. It was moving fast and almost to me. Apparently, it didn't care if something jumped out in front of it. It was close enough now that I could see it was a big wrecked truck. It must have been one of the ones that deliver corn from the farm. I waved my arms in hopes of flagging it down, and perhaps grabbing a ride home. The problem was that it was going the opposite direction, and there weren't many places on this road where a big rig could turn around, even if it would. Waving my arms, I still stayed on the side of the road. If the driver didn't see me, or worse, it didn't care. I didn't want to be found in the middle of the road days later, as nothing more than an unidentifiable bloody lump of goo sitting in the middle of the road for crows to peck at. The truck was almost here. My arms waved furiously, but it didn't seem to be slowing down. Either the driver was having a hard time staying awake as often as I did on this road, or he was just ignoring me. It was so near the headlights blinded me, and I had to hold my hands over my eyes. Just then, I felt something push the middle of my back so hard I lost my balance and fell in the middle of the road, with the truck bearing down on me. My mind went into panic mode, and I scurried like a crab towards the side of the road, the truck's tires missing me by mere inches. As I rolled into the grass on the far side of the road, the wind from the passing truck washed over me so strong. If I'd been standing, it could have knocked me down. I watched in shock as the truck continued on. Its brake lights didn't even flash for a moment. Hopelessness and rage fought for control as I watched the lights disappear into the distance. It didn't even dawn on me how I ended up in the middle of the road until I stopped to think about it. Someone or something had pushed me. Someone or something wanted me dead. I shone my light over into the corn and stared at the other side of the road. Something in the corn stared back. All I could see were a pair of glowing eyes. They were something between white and yellow. I seemed to remember reading something that a predator's eyes would shine white or yellow when reflecting. This, plus the fact that this thing had just tried to commit truckicide, made me think the chances of me getting home tonight in one piece were next to zero. It must have sensed my fear and felt emboldened by it, because it stepped out of the corn towards me. It took my mind a moment to sink in what I was seeing. It was hideous, with large protruding eyes, pale skin, and many more legs and arms than any animal was supposed to have, at least any natural animal. The extra arms dangled just behind its neck, but they looked oddly human with the exception of thorns growing out of them and razor-sharp claws. It looked like something out of a horror movie, as if something had been playing around in the gene pool and the lifeguards blew the whistle on them. It was bigger than a dog, but had no fur, like it had just been skinned. The thing that sealed the deal was its enormous sharp teeth that it showed when it hissed at me and started across the road. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran into the field on my side of the road. When I was younger, my friends and I used to play hide and seek in the cornfields, and one of the first things I learned was never run in a straight line. I zigzagged and double-backed as the terror in my mind gave my feet the will and strength to escape. At least the moon was half full, or was it half empty, giving me a little light to see my path. And then as suddenly as I had started, I stopped, dropped, and did everything I could do to be quiet and still as possible. It wasn't easy, especially at first when my breaths were coming in ragged gasps and I had to cover my mouth, trying to breathe slowly and quietly when my oxygen-starved lungs were screaming for more air as quickly as possible. One of the lessons I learned early on in my hide-and-seek career was when you dropped, make sure you're in a comfortable position. I've forgotten that lesson tonight, maybe out of sheer terror. When I dropped, instead of sitting, I was on my knees in the ready position, if I had to run quickly. A wise position to be in if I were to be found right away. However, after 15 minutes of sitting on my knees, I realized my mistake. I was about to change positions when I heard a soft rustling of corn stalks behind me. Every fiber of my being froze, and I stopped breathing. It moved slowly, searching methodically. Even though I knew it was trying to make as little noise as possible, I could hear the soft rustling of corn stalk brushing against it and feeling the ground give slightly with every step it took. It was in the row beside me. I knew it was a bad decision, but I looked over at the spaces in between the stalks at its horrifying body. It was bigger than a dog, but the extra arms it didn't walk on were covered with sharp-looking thorns and claws. I didn't dare look as far as its face and mouth, for I feared it would start running right then. And then it hit me. If I could see it, then it could possibly see me. Was this thing just toying with me? I'd seen that so many times as a kid. The seeker would pretend not to see someone hiding and pass by them, only to jump back and scare the crap out of them a moment later. This creature was almost past me. Was I about to suffer the same fate? Would it pass me, letting me believe I was in the clear, only to whip around and sink its claws and teeth into me? I was about to start shaking. I could feel it. I had to get that under control real quick. There was still a chance it hadn't seen me. That was the only hope I clung to. If it knew I was here, then there was nothing I could do about it anyway. I wasn't that little kid anymore. I couldn't jump up and sprint at a moment's notice. I was amazed my feet had allowed me to run into the cornfield. And there it was. I hadn't thought about my feet the entire time I was running in fear. But now that I wasn't, the pain came back stronger than ever. It was all I could do not to gasp from the strength of it. I imagined if this creature was chewing my feet off, it would not have felt much worse. I winced and grimaced, but did all I could do not to make any sound. Closing my eyes, I focused on anything I could except the pain, in a vain effort to make it go away, or at least abate it. It was a few minutes until it began to subside. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. Not just further down the row, gone like vanished. At first I felt relieved, but then I realized I had no idea where it was. It could literally be right behind me, and I wouldn't know. I felt the panic rising in my mind and had to fight to keep it down. Okay, it passed me. So unless it knows I'm here, I thought, there's no reason it would stick around this area with so much more field to search. If it does know I'm here, I'm dead anyways, and there's nothing I can do about it. At least if I die, my feet won't hurt anymore. As strange as it sounded, that seemed to calm me down for a moment. Next, I focused on getting in a more comfortable position. My knees were screaming for mercy. I turned and sat in the cold dirt, making surprisingly little sound. Now was the time to rest for a minute, then consider my options. I still had my flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. At least I was getting a little light from the moon. Somewhere during the commotion, I must have dropped my bag. A shame, really, because I could have thrown it in the opposite direction to misdirect the creature. Sitting there was an option, but it wasn't one that would get me home. I could crawl out to the road and continue my way on, hoping that the creature was so busy looking for me it wouldn't notice. I chuckled softly at the ludicrousness of that plan, and then I stopped. Why not? I thought. If it already passed me and didn't know where I was, then maybe it would keep searching, oblivious that I had quit the deadly game of hide-and-seek and was heading home. The longer I thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. At least it was a plan, something to focus on rather than impotent fear. I turned around as quietly as possible and began crawling towards the road. After a short time, I had enough of that and stood, stepping sideways to brush against a few of the leaves as possible. I found the noise I made was less than what I did when I was crawling, but it was still noise. I had no idea how near or far that thing was, and if it was too close, it was bound to hear me. The thought made me want to go faster, but I realized that panic would only get me caught. Besides, maybe it was making just as much noise looking for me. As I comforted myself with that thought, I felt the first raindrop hit my cheek. Looking up, I watched the moon disappear behind rain clouds, and with that went my light. At this point, it didn't matter. I was in the road that was heading towards the road, hopefully, and once I stepped out onto the road, I could use my flashlight again, covering it up and only allowing a sliver of light to escape at a time. I kept walking, glancing behind me from time to time as the rain intensified. It wasn't long until the fear of the last hour or so gave way to the shivering as the cold rain soaked into my clothes. I once again lamented not bringing a coat. All I could see were a few corn stalks in front of me. The storm had robbed me of even the little light that the moon had provided. The rain pounded harder so that I could barely hear myself walking. I took the opportunity to walk faster when suddenly the cornstalks disappeared. It happened so fast I nearly lost my balance and fell face first onto the road. I had made it out of the field. I felt like hooting and hollering, but that would just tell the monster where I was. Instead, I turned my flashlight on and covered it with my hand. Looking left and right, I remembered which side of the road I was on and turned left to start for home again. I breathed a silent prayer that this thing would stay lost in the field until I was home, in bed, asleep. The rain was coming down in shades, but I trudged on through it. The monster chasing me took away any thoughts of rest breaks. The next time I'd sit down would be in my living room. I limped on through the rain, pain shooting through my feet, but I didn't care. I wondered if I would make it all the way home. I'd have to be at least 6 or 7 miles away, through the pouring rain, with a homicidal monster hunting me. I never thought all that would happen when I left for work this morning. As I pondered my survival, the rain in front of me began to glow. I stopped and watched as a shadowed figure rose out of the pavement. Now what? I thought. Have I entered the freaking Twilight Zone? Staring at this glowing apparition, I suddenly realized it was my shadow. I whipped around and saw a truck barreling down the road towards me. It could be my salvation or my doom. I aimed my light at the driver's windshield and prayed for the best. For one long moment, nothing changed. The truck kept coming closer, just as fast as ever. Then, miracle of miracles, I heard it slow with the jake brake and eventually come to a stop beside me. The driver's side window came down, and a large woman stuck her head out through it. "Are you nuts?" she screamed. "You trying to get yourself killed?" "No, ma'am. My car broke down," I called back. "I just want to get home." She shook her head. "Where's home?" I pointed in the direction she was headed. "Around 7 miles that way." She looked at me as I stood there in the pouring rain, and for an instant, I thought she'd roll up her window and leave me standing there. Of all the terrors I dealt with tonight, that'd be the worst. "All right, get in," she said, nodding towards the passenger side. I ran around and climbed up into the cab, profusely apologizing for getting her seat wet. "It's a company truck," she said. "It doesn't matter to me." She put the truck in gear and it slowly started forward as I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. "Was that your car back there in the middle of the road?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She looked at her odometer. "Well, you walked around 4 miles so far," she said. I nodded as we picked up speed. Glancing in the side mirror, I saw something running down the road after us, but losing ground quickly. I knew I had escaped death by a margin of a minute. Sighing deeply, I swore to never walk this road again, even if I broke down. I would sit in the car and wait for someone to happen by. We passed a large farm that I knew was her destination and stopped 2 miles later when we got to my house. It was the only one at the end of the cul-de-sac. The realtor told me that we were going to tear it down because the housing development was supposed to start, but never happened. The company had gone out of business before they could build anything other than the model house. It had sat empty for years, falling into despair. Instead of tearing it down, they rented it to me, after doing just enough to make it livable. "Is this it?" she said, turning partway through and stopping. "Home sweet home," I said. "Thank you very much. You're literally a lifesaver." She looked at me with a question in her eyes, but I was already climbing out of the cab and closing the door. I ran to the front door, dodging raindrops as I dug out my keys and unlocked it. Closing and locking the door behind me was the best feeling I had in a long time. I painfully pulled off my shoes and left them on the mat beside the door, went into the laundry room and stripped off my wet clothes. Next was a shower, before throwing on a pair of pajamas and going to bed. Laying there under my warm blanket and my soft bed made the rest of the day feel like a nightmare. There was still the problem of what I was going to do about a car and how I was going to get to work, but those would wait until I got a good night's sleep. The last thing I thought about was that monster and how I cheated death. I wondered how many of those things were roaming around and what it was, and how many people had disappeared like I nearly had.